is Jason of Archaix.com. It's time to set the record straight. This is part one of the Anunna files. I hope you enjoy the presentation. We have many coming on the Anunnaki, and we're going to set the record straight as far as the massive amount of disinformation about the Anunna, later called Anunnaki in ancient Babylon. There are people making their careers off this disinformation, and they know it's wrong, or their research is just very shoddy. But Zechariah Sitchin was a pioneer, but he did us a great disservice in many areas of the research. Others are coming behind him and copying his mistakes. We're going to set the record straight. This is JasonArchaix.com. Enjoy the presentation. More coming real rapidly. It is shameful. In today's modern society, so many take offense at any broach of the topic of race, as if it is a subject hallowed, not to be spoken nor explored. Our ancient masters wanted it this way. If you get offended at what you read or hear, why not analyze why? Emotional responses seem to be all that the majority are able to produce, and the reasoning for this is programming. The media takes great advantage of this, knowing that frenzied emotional reaction to troubling data is all most people are capable of. Don't be a victim anymore. We are who we are for reasons beyond our control. Race is not a subject to be shunned, but to explore. In prior videos, it has already been explained that the exiled Jews in Babylonia misunderstood the many references to the Adamu in the records of the great libraries, changing Adamu from its original description of the human race before the deluge cataclysm to a pronoun for an individual's name. They created Adam. This is why, after Adam was mentioned in Genesis, he is then forgotten in the vast archives of the Old Testament. Only in the late rabbinical works after the Jews came back from Babylon did the writings of Adam surface. Pure priestly inventions like the Book of Adam and Eve. The father of humanity should have been mentioned everywhere in the Holy Writ, but he is not, because he was never a man, but instead a designation for early mankind, the ancient Semitic Adamu. The Chaldean account of the creation shows that there was an original race of men at the beginning of Chaldean history, a dark race, the Zalmat Kakadi, who were called Adami or Adami, as opposed to the light-skinned race called the Sarku or Sharku. Shar is a title for a ruler. Ignatius Donnelly wrote, "The name Adam is used in these legends, but as the name of a race, not of a person." The Jewish chronographers exiled to Babylonia invented the Adam to Seth lineage, making Enoch the seventh, misunderstanding the older Babylonian references to Adamu for what they were describing as early humans, a dark and red-skinned race with black hair and eyes and smooth skin with no facial hair, who were created by the Anunnaki. The Genesis and Sumerian accounts of Noah's lineage do not disagree. Enki created primitive humans from primate Anunna DNA, and then manufactured an upgraded type of humans by adding more Anunnaki DNA. Enki then used Anunna females to birth the upgrades, which produced civilized humans that could procreate on their own. These were first the Adamu. And of this stock were Oriental people, the black-headed people, a description used by the Sumerians to describe themselves over and over in their writings. The writings describing history before the Great Flood have the common theme that initially the entire world was populated by black-haired, black-eyed people of small stature and brown and red skin, smooth, no hair on their bodies and no beards. It was a world when Caucasians did not exist. At least in this world, in the same continents as those that recorded these histories and their traditions. As will be seen in another video, the first appearance of white people was a major theme of the pre-flood world. Scientifically, the racial differences between Negroid, Mongoloid, Amerindic, and Caucasoid are inexplicable. skull thickness, cranial proportions and capacity, skeletal structure, musculature, blood types, pigmentation, dermal thickness, cerebral development, protuberance of features. The hair and eye color of the dark pre-Caucasian humans are not the result of natural selection or evolution, but the product of genetic engineering using core primate DNA with infusions of their own coding. Humans are the product of 30,000 genes separated only by 300 genes from chimpanzees, a 1% difference. But humans contain 223 genes that have no evolutionary predecessors. And with genes, even only a few genetic variations can result in vast differences. Where did these 223 genes come from? For they link every human type on this planet together. Homo Anunna brought these genes here. Geneticists know that over 98% of human DNA is identical to that of chimpanzees. Only 1 through 4% of modern human DNA is Neanderthalic. However, this 1 through 4% is not found in native African Negroid DNA. The more we discover, the more evidence we find of different DNA designer programs effected in antiquity to populate the Earth. In tracking mitochondrial DNA back as far as it can go has revealed to geneticists that the modern human race is a family of 33 clans. What makes the human species human is not our pedigree, but our spirituality. Our bodies are but biological containers, DNA preservations housing lost but immortal spirits. The myriads of gene combinations are why life can exist in virtually every biospheric condition. Human DNA is extraterrestrial, interplanetary, and quite likely intergalactic. The earlier Earth-born races of Neanderthal and Cro-Magnon were long ago distinguished from the moon-born races of dark humans linked culturally by their veneration of goddesses, matriarchal peoples before the Great Deluge Cataclysm in the month of May 2239 BC. Negroid, Mongoloid, Amerindic, and Dark Caucasoid, the 4 great brother races of remembered antiquity who existed on Earth before the white Caucasian race and their own patriarchal sun cultures, the bearded white children of the sun called Shemsu Hor in ancient Egypt. The moon goddess cultures venerated the mother of all living, her symbol for over 3,000 years of both antediluvian and post-flood history being the crescent moon. The dark Homo sapiens recalled their origin from Homo Anunna birth goddesses, who descended from the lunar habitats when the moon was deliberately placed in its dead orbit by the Anunna in the year 4039 BC. These Anunna, better known as Anunnaki later by the Babylonians, were rebels of their race who called the moon by the name of Sin. It was a title later attached to them by humans when they became known as the Sinners, who birthed the first Adamu, the first people. Hopi tradition tells that their ancestors arrived to the 4th world by migrating through 3 previous worlds by the aid of Spider Grandmother. Osage's Indians of North American plains tell that they once lived in the sky way beyond the earth. They were the children of the sun and moon, told by their moon mother to go live on the earth. The Senecas were descended from the Star Woman. There are so many recorded traditions of non-Caucasian peoples remembering that their origin was from a creatrix or from the moon that we cannot possibly list them all here. While the dark races were programmed to obey, to follow, they were also heavily edited, their coding modified to impede creativity, genetic barriers erected, governors set in place to guarantee that upon their own initiative they could not knit together the requisite thoughts that would guide them toward any productivity that would result in erecting a civilization to rival the Anunna. The mistakes made with Cro-Magnon would not be revisited, and we will do a video on that. These genetic parameters have functioned so perfectly for so long that every Negroid, Mongolid, Amerindic, and Oriental people have, since the collapse of their ancient civilization, have continued for thousands of years as Neolithic farmers and hunter-gatherers unless they profited by contact with another Caucasian people as in the 3rd millennium BC, when the Amorite, Hurrian, Aryan migrations into the Near East, India, Palestine, and Egypt, and again in these last 4 centuries with the global European colonization of the world. This was a genetic program that was instigated by people so they could not rival their creators. The establishment version of human racial evolution propagated today is extremely racist, proclaiming that modern humans descended from monkeys. The truth is occulted that Homo sapiens are the amalgamation of many parts, and yes, chimpanzee DNA is greatly a part of our genetic makeup. But the differences between human types is not from evolutionary development. The bullcrap passed off as history we are force-fed is wrong. Contrary to what is popularly taught, the Amerindian of North America is not Asian. They did not cross a frozen land bridge over the Pacific or Atlantic. O blood type is the prevailing type of the American Indians, but Orientals are almost all B types. From the Mongolian stock, further modification produced the High Oriental, civilized goddess worshippers, the first Homo sapiens civilized culture after Cro-Magnon, the pre-flood ancestors of the Chinese, Japanese, Koreans, Vietnamese, and other Oriental peoples today. These High Orientals were also the predecessors of the white Caucasian peoples who were not yet settled on this earth. That the goddess cults and matriarchal cultures are much older than the appearance of Caucasians in this world, in the traditions of the world, cannot be disputed. Beginning in 4039 BC with the sudden appearance of Anunna, the capture flood in Earth's orbit, the Anunna began a 144-year campaign inside lunar habitats, creating colonies of Negroid, Mongolid, Amerindic, and Dark Caucasoid peoples. Through the birth goddesses campaigns, these grew in population and were kept separate deliberately, kept inside their lunar habitats until the pass of the Phoenix weapon in 3895 BC, which started a new heavens and new earth through a pole shift cataclysm. When Phoenix transited in 3895 BC, the earth suffered a devastating pole shift, quakes, floods, volcanic fallout, meteoric rains as entire continents slipped under oceans, and new seas appeared on what was formerly dry land. It was indeed a new heavens and new earth. They were effected, for the stars were no longer in the places they had been. The new pole star became Alpha Draconis, the eye of the dragon, and the moon age began that would last 1,656 years to the Great Flood. This is the 1656 years mentioned in Genesis. This age is characterized by the appearance of the vapor canopy that hid the sun by day while diffusing light in the temperate to tropical world, while magnifying the moon and stars at night, as the dark side of the atmosphere became a nightly magnifying lens into the heavens. The anciently popular legends of the birth of the sun are memories of the collapse of this vapor canopy at the Great Deluge in 2239 BC, again by the Phoenix weapon. During the pre-flood world, the entire day's sky was well lit, but the vapor canopy blocked out the circular orb of the sun. During the 3895 BC pole shift destruction, the last of the Neanderthal vanished and the Cro-Magnon population was totally decimated. The Anunna planted their new Homo sapien colonies in different areas of the world. The invention of races, a deliberate act of divisiveness. We are told by establishment anthropologists that the creation of the races and the distinctions between different races on this planet today is the result of hundreds of thousands of development periods. Not true. This world, this simulation that we exist within, is a catastrophism. It's a simulated holography of a series of catastrophes, and these catastrophes end prior simulations and begin new ones. People, communities are introduced just as fast and as rapidly as they are whisked away. We have videos about whole human populations vanishing in cataclysms. Their cities are buried in red mud, but not a single skeleton is found. This is the first of our Anunnaki videos. We are just now beginning a long series of videos that are going to explore this phenomenon that has taken the world by storm. This identity of the Anunna and Anunnaki. And we're going to separate fact from fiction. And we're going to do away with so much of this misinformation that was put out by not just Zechariah Sitchin, but many of his followers. It's going to get dark before you become enlightened. We're going to go down this rabbit hole together. Some of the things you're not going to like hearing, but we're all in this together. It doesn't matter if you're white, black, American Indian, Oriental, Aboriginal. It doesn't matter. We cannot change the facts just because we have feelings that tell us otherwise. Welcome to part 2 of the Anunna Files. Disturbing information, but nonetheless, it's needed. If we're going to educate ourselves, if we're going to figure out exactly why events are unfolding today, we need to know how they unfolded yesterday. And this is the purpose of these videos. We live in a containment field, and I'm always trying to remind my listeners that our world is not what you think. We are something so incredibly, vastly powerful that something contained us. And then that something, because it couldn't confine us, we could still find ways out, which we'll go into in our next video on the Cro-Magnon. There's the Phoenix weapon, the Cataclysm protocols, the genetic manipulation of the human species to create divisiveness is very specifically designed. These are attacks against us to keep us in a state of arrested development. There is no difference fundamentally between a white man and an Asian, a black man and a white man. Without the media controls continually reminding us of our disparities, we would get along just fine. But there's something about this world that wants to create disunity, divisiveness. Something fears the human soul. We'll get to that. We've already broached that topic several times in other Archaix videos. But in this series, the Anunna Files, we're going deeper. We are discussing topics and require a maturity from you, not to get angry about what you hear, but to help us investigate it. Let's get to the bottom of what happened in the ancient world. This video is disturbing, but these videos are going to get more and more disturbing until we start seeing with clarity that we have all been manipulated. Something wants to keep us here. Much of the confusion and disparities between elements of the same stories that have survived the ancient world of legends, oral traditions, written records are reconciled by acknowledging that we are today looking backward to the memories of 2 or 3 entirely different groups. The indigenous recollections of pre-Caucasian people who held that they were created by hideous reptoid beings does not nullify the later Caucasian records of Amorite-dominated Babylonia and Sumer that the bearded white human race was created by bearded white human-like gods. Dark humans anciently recalled the Nordic appearances of gods and the unexpected births of white babies, but Caucasian legends and lore have only remembered white Caucasian gods and predecessors. It is as if the Caucasian mindset has been scrubbed of its own history. Anunnaki human unions continued for at least 6 centuries, the 2 separate races sharing the same gene pool. This history is considered today definitely racist, but nonetheless true, and supported by non-Caucasian ancient testimony. The entire Genesis 6 passage concerning the sons of gods and the daughters of men that created a mighty race of heroes, men of renown, is the old world's testimony of the birth of a new race into the world before the flood, the Caucasian race, who inherited the height, intellect, physical characteristics, beards and eyes, and knowledges and technology of their Homo Anunna fathers. In the story of the Anunnaki, we have the appearance on Earth of ghost white spacefaring humans from somewhere else who through a premeditated plan modified a small population out of the vast hordes of dark peoples on this planet and refined them to the point where they could easily procreate with them with no complications. These visitors bestow information and technology to their new genetic counterparts and then disappeared again in most part, though there is evidence that a faction of the Anunna remained on Earth to eventually marry into, build family dynasties, and die among their earthborn kin. Those who from heaven to earth fell, or Anunnaki, were never gods. They were humans who had gone extremely pale with fair eyes and hair by living in an entirely different biosphere. Every human on Earth today is in some degree Anunnaki descended. We possess all their genetics. Sumerians prided themselves as being the black-headed people, and pictures on their reliefs show them as smooth skin with no facial hair, but on their seals, statuary, and reliefs, the gods, called Anunna in Sumer, are always depicted with bearded faces. The Genesis text reads, "Let us make man in our image after our likeness, and also, behold, the man has become as one of us, to discern good and evil." This addendum about good and evil is not a part of the earlier Sumerian traditions, but it's a religionist addition to the story that totally ensnares humanity in a spiritual conflict that originally found fault and error only in the action of the gods, our creators, in the manufacturing of humans, the created. The original sin was never ours. Not only were the narratives of Sumerian antiquity given as first-person accounts, as also found in the book of Genesis, told to the people by the Anunna themselves, but some Anunnaki never left Earth. They remained marooned to live among the human family. William Bramley in Gods of Eden wrote, "Human beings appear to be a slave race, languishing on an isolated planet in a small galaxy. As such, the human race was once a source of labor for an extraterrestrial civilization and still remains a possession today." When modern Homo sapiens served and lived among Homo Anunna from 3439 BC to 2647 BC, the concept of their world was more sophisticated than mankind 1,000 years later. The threefold division of reality concerned the heavens, the realm of the gods, the Anunna, what we call space, and Earth, where men lived with the gods, and the underworld, or the deep, the Abzu, ruled by the serpent, who was Enki, father of the Caucasian race. The Nordic division was similar to the Sumerian beliefs. Earth was Midgard, and the underworld was Nephilim, the land of the elves, the alien greys, the Semitic Nephilim, being the fallen ones who fathered the Caucasian offspring of the sons of gods, Anunnaki. Long after the departure of the Anunna in 2647 BC, this threefold division took on the religious concepts of a heaven independent of interplanetary space, an Earth where gods did not physically exist, and a hell instead of a network of deep Earth biospheres, the underground habitats occupied not by colonies of Anunnaki, greys, and humans, but by demons, elves, and dwarves. As these videos will show, in the progression of the data as it unfolds, the Caucasian race was created long after the races were already well established on this earth. And the Caucasian race was established because of a major rift in Anunna society. There was a war, and in this civil war, the revolters, the rebellers, those who were considered the bad guys, in an effort to continue the propagation of their own species, Earthside created the Caucasian race as an act of rebellion. The ancient person Enki violated the pre-flood status quo. He led a benefactor sect of Homo Anunna who committed the ultimate treachery against their own civilization. By mating physically with their product, the daughters of men, these rebellious Anunna fathered the ancestors of the Caucasian race, its Aryan and Semitic branches, who not only inherited the fair-featured characteristics of these benefactors, but also received some technology, written records, knowledges, and the genetic traits of imagination, creativity, inventiveness, abstraction, and the colonial spirit. While all races have proven to be equally intelligent as Caucasians, the entire history of the world's past 5,000 years demonstrates century by century that Homo Anunna Homo Anunna's synaptic fail-safes have without fail retarded the ability, the growth, and the prosperity of all races except Caucasians. The Anunnaki histories have basically oversimplified the ancient phenomenon of a genetic war that was fought against mankind. Also, the oversimplification of the Anunnaki as being strictly an extraterrestrial species of aliens ignores the great variety of types mentioned or alluded to in the ancient texts as pieced together by Sitchin and many other authors. Anunna, who had never left Nibiru, their home, who had descended to Earth, those who had descended to Earth, who later became a separate group, those who were born on Earth from off-world parents, those who were born on Earth of unions between off-world and earthborn parents, those who were born of parents both earthborn. These distinctions are mentionable because of the complexities of DNA, activation, deactivation of whole gene sequences, or latent genes programmed to respond to certain environmental stimuli as cells transfer information at conception with the influence of various biospheres. We can add to this list the Anunna who were stationed or born in lunar habitats, the Anunna who were born on Mars, which was called Lamu, the Igigi, the Watchers, the Anunna who were born on way stations in the Sol system or in the Nemesis system where they had come from, on asteroids and other lunar bodies that we are unfamiliar with. The variations in the human genome due to these disparate environments may not have been so marked. However, when crossbreeding with Homo sapiens at different stages of genetic manufacturing, the changes barely noticed between Anunna of variant backgrounds actually produced drastic changes in Homo sapiens descended from them. There are no ancient references to an Anunnaki crossbreeding with Negroid humans. In fact, Homo sapiens, including Negroid, were not considered breeding stock until they were upgraded as Adamu, from the birth goddesses campaigns. The red-skinned, black-haired, black-eyed, smooth-skinned humans able to procreate on their own. To date, we have found the archaeological evidence of cities and civilizations that reached a very high level of sophistication, built by Negroid, by Mongoloid, by the Amerindic and the Dark Caucasoid races of the past. But in every instance, those civilizations collapsed and fell. Whereas when Caucasians spread around the world and began colonizing and reintroducing elements of civilization, these civilizations again had a renaissance and they revived, and in every historical instance, a phoenix cataclysm totally ended every civilization that had reached such a high attainability, except for those who suffered the genetic fail-safes that they basically imploded their own cultures. It's like a genetic attack. It was by design. After experimental periods were conducted, once DNA compatibility was maintained, the several different types of Anunna mated with the daughters of men, producing Homo sapiens sapiens who physically appeared in the likeness of their Anunna fathers. In the beginning of this interbreeding campaign, there was a great diversity which produced Caucasian groups, all being bearded. These groups were very tall, blonde, blue, hazel, gray, green-eyed. Average height, blonde, blue, hazel, gray, and green-eyed. Very tall, with red hair, blue, hazel, gray, or green-eyed. And average height, which was red-haired, blue, hazel, gray, or green-eyed. 4 different types, all varying in different body types, but basically of the same parentage. Caucasians today with brown and black hair or eyes is simply due to the same intermarriages, migrations, and conquests that resulted with the non-Caucasians today having blue, hazel, gray, and green eyes and lighter, fairer features and even facial hair. The Anunna born on Earth were not Nibiru loyalists. Earth native Anunna had little in common with space-born Anunna, and the second-generation Earth-born Anunna even less. In the time before the deluge, rivalries in Anunnaki colonies probably transferred to rivalries among the human workers of different regions, also developing into human breeding programs left off at variant stages of racial maturation. The manufacturing of human workers was interrupted by conflict, hastened, altered to produce armies quickly. In the days before the Great Flood cataclysm in the 23rd century BC, a human's physical coloring and features marked him like a brand. Designer DNA allowing Anunna overlords to know what product belonged to them or to another. Ownership of worker humans could not be argued when physical traits separated Homo sapiens from other Homo sapiens with totally different characteristics because they were owned by someone else. The common denominator between the antediluvian DNA designer worker races was that of dark skin, black hair and eyes, and smooth skin with no beards. The world was filled with millions of these Negroid, Mongoloid, Amerindic, and dark Caucasoid peoples who all venerated the mother goddess and all claimed the moon as the symbol of their race. The minority before the deluge during the period of 2839 to 2239 BC were white-skinned, fair-eyed, and featured Caucasians who were directly fathered by the Anunna, a race of patriarchal people who remembered their origin from male gods, a new race of fair-featured people that the dark races called the children of the sun. This distinction, initially racial for the fiery golden color hair of Caucasian heads, quickly degenerated into complex solar and lunar dynasties that fashioned religions preserving the lunar goddess connection and solar all-father relationship. Humans focusing on humans after the departure of the Anunna in 2647 BC, the final year of the contact period, led to the stellar theologies of subordinate deities, the Anunna in service to a goddess, the moon or god, the sun. Sin, the name of the moon, was originally male in the Sumerian text, but this gender identity among goddess worshippers fell into disrepute, just as did the older solar goddess associations in the Far East. Although in the context of this video and other videos I continually reference the Anunnaki as gods, you must understand I'm only referencing in that way because that's what they were regarded as. However, the evidence is very clear that a very strange pale race showed up among the dark races. These people had beards and they were regarded as gods, but they were human. There is no doubt in my mind that these were merely humans coming from somewhere else, either deep earth biospheres after a cataclysm or from an entirely different continent. This great division in the pre-flood world separating the Caucasian civilizers from all the lunar goddess venerating dark races manifested in a whole new unique way after the vanishing of the gods. End of the contact period in 2647 BC. Two major cultural themes survived the pre-flood world to be carried on after the destruction. Two competing ways of life clashed, forging two distinct types of dynasties, the Hunter Kings and the Shepherd Kings. These divisions among the human family were at variance with one another, and their ethnicities were markedly different. The Hurrian, Aryan, Amorite, Syrian, Phoenician, Israelite, Ionian, fair-featured white descendants of Noah and Enoch, Enki, founded the powerful Shepherd King dynasties of the Western Fertile Crescent. Egypt, Libya, Mitanni, Urartu, India, Anatolia, Syria, Lebanon in the Bronze Age, 2nd millennium BC. The Shepherd King civilizations were patriarchal with trade alliance economies, all maritime nations, great builders, spiritual instructors, establishers of law codes and societies, mighty in war and expert navigators. As saviors of human communities victimized by raiding nomads and upholders of civilization and law, the Caucasian Shepherd King nations and occupying dynasties continued the legacy of the benevolent Anunna who had bioengineered the white-bearded people and then bred with them. In ancient Peru, in China, in India, and in Egypt, these civilizers appeared and brought renaissance to these indigenous populations and built a mighty empire which would later resurrect as the Heliolithic maritime empire, for which we will be doing a video about. The Hunter Kings were aggressors, tyrants, destroyers of the harvest, humanity, opposed to the Shepherd Kings who protected the flock. In the Jewish narrative of Genesis, this is found in the conflict between the gentle Jacob and his violent brother Esau, the hunter. The major distinction between the nations having Hunter King and Shepherd King dynasties was entirely racial. Nomadic, Negroid, Mongoloid, Amerindic, and Dark Caucasoid hunter-gatherers made up the Hunter Kings of Dravidian India, Africa, Arabia that founded the early post-Diluvian cultures of Egypt, the Indus, Akkad, Babylonia, Hittite Anatolia before the Shepherd Kings imposed their own dynasties over them by conquer. The Shepherd Kings were not the only Caucasians, but as descendants of Enki, Enoch, they were the fairest, having the most Anunna DNA. The Aryans were not hunters or nomads as collective ways of life, but dwelt in towns with highways. They employed a decimal system of enumeration. Max Muller wrote that this was one of the most marvelous achievements of the human mind based on an abstract conception of quantity, and it was used everywhere in the trade alliances set up by the Aryans and the Hurrian dynasties. In Hindu traditional histories, the Asuras were a race of elder gods born of venerated mothers to Caspaya. The non-Aryan Asuras were already established when a second race was suddenly born called the Adatyas, who quickly rose to dominance and were resented by the older Asuras. The Wars of Gods and Men, Zechariah Sitchin notes that the non-Aryan name of Asuras was of Near Eastern origin akin to Ashur, Asar, Osiris, and that in Hindu tradition, the Asuras became evil gods or demons, whereas the Adatyas assumed the role of gods. Envy and contention between the first race and that which came after led to war during a time when Earth produced food without cultivation, when a global famine occurred. The Satapatha Brahmana reads of a widespread conflict, wars fought for superiority and resources. The gods, Adatyas, vanquished the Asuras, who later rose up and defeated the gods. Ultimately, the gods finally put down the Asuras. We have, in this Hindu tradition, the pre-flood memory of the Asuras and the two distinct types of Homo sapiens, those of older dark humans venerating their mother goddesses and the later patriarchal Aryan Adatyas, the sons of the gods. We have, right here, preserved in Vedic traditions, a major worldwide racial conflict involving everybody against Caucasians before the flood. That the Anunna were not gods is demonstrated in that Zechariah Sitchin had found references to an Anunna belief in the identity of the creator of all, who influenced Enki, who we know as Enoch, to create humanity and again prompt him to warn humans of the coming flood. After the deluge, at seeing that pockets of humans survived the disaster, many Anunna concluded that it was the will of the creator of all that they should live. It seems clear that the white-bearded Anunnaki race were entirely human. They are indistinguishable from the fairest of European Caucasians today. They were not gods in any sense of the word. Putting all the pieces together, we have a world filled with humans after the fading away of Cro-Magnon, a world full of Homo sapiens of four primary racial groups. Their world was interrupted by the sudden appearance of technologically advanced Caucasians that they mistook for gods, people who came from somewhere else, and thus began the traditions of the fifth brother race. To better understand the genetic manipulation, why it was necessary for someone in ancient past to genetically damage people on this planet, we have to go back and look at what happened with the Cro-Magnon. And we have to throw away the BS the establishment has told us about them because it's wrong. The story of the Cro-Magnon is both fascinating and absolutely tragic. Welcome to our third video in this series, the Anunna Files. Now, long before Genesis, the history that Genesis conveys, before many of the civilizations that you've come to know, before the Greeks, the Egyptians, the Elamites, before every single civilization in recorded history, there was a race of people on this planet, and they wore pants, and they had button-down shirts, and they wore sandals with stitching. They were master artists. But you know what? We've been told a lie about these people, and that's what this video is about. Welcome to the world of the Cro-Magnon. They aren't anything that you've been taught. The entire Cro-Magnon image of the anthropologist is a lie. One of the greatest anthropological mysteries of prehistory is how the Neanderthal abruptly appeared all over this earth. And then evolution cannot explain the abrupt disappearance of Neanderthal, a whole well-entrenched species. So baffling and damaging is this sudden appearance that the scientific acudummies have over and over been caught manufacturing fake fossil hominid predecessors to Neanderthal. They even passed off on us pig bones. No anthropoids have long hair growing from the top of their heads, so how did humans acquire it? The anthropoids have thick body hair. Humans are basically hairless. Natural selection could never have phased out body hair while increasing the hair on the top of the head. Humans do have chimpanzee DNA, but the entire archaeological record of any evolutionary development between chimp ancestors and descended humans exists nowhere on Earth. Professor Isley wrote, I voiced the suspicion that Homo sapiens became separated from the ape tribe by a deliberately planned mutation. Yes, that quote was from over 50 years ago. David Icke, a very controversial writer, wrote, the reason science has been unable to find missing links in human genetic evolution is because there aren't any. The sudden changes in the human form were due to extraterrestrial intervention. Again, 50 years ago, Max Flint and Otto Binder wrote, if something does not work solely by blind chance, who is tipping the scales? My answer is Homo Anunna, more popularly referred to as the Anunnaki. Before 5239 BC, Homo Anunnas returned to the Earth's surface to find that their robust, dark-skinned hominid upgrade manufactured at their previous visit, known to us as Neanderthal, were inadequate for their mining needs. Unsupervised, this primitive Homo inferior has fallen into disorganized hunter-gatherer groups who domiciled in caves rather than worked them for ore. While bred for strength, they were intelligent and artistic. The disappointed Anunna visiting Earth let them be and redesigned Homo inferior into a more capable worker. This is Cro-Magnon, who exploded onto the scene. No evolutionary development, just appeared. Whole communities of Cro-Magnon. Today, scientists accept that Neanderthals were not human ancestors, but were an entirely different race. Mitochondrial DNA analysis concludes that Neanderthals did not contribute substantially to the modern human genome. Cro-Magnon man is an anomaly, superior to Neanderthal and of an independent lineage. Cro-Magnon appeared suddenly with mysteriously improved skeletal characteristics and with a cranial capacity that is amazingly in excess of 100 cubic centimeters of that of modern man. M.D. Shorn in Elder Gods in Antiquity wrote that Cro-Magnon man simply appeared suddenly on Earth within the midst of Neanderthals. Science simply does not know how such an event could have occurred. What? These brainiacs assert that the dinosaurs were wiped out 65 million years ago and that Cro-Magnon were supposed to be 64.5 million years closer in time to us today, and they can't solve this local mystery? So much for nicely packaged theories. Cro-Magnon man is classified as Homo sapiens sapiens. It's the same as us. It is a theory that Cro-Magnon wiped out the Neanderthal. The Cro-Magnon are not descended from Neanderthal no more than Homo sapiens are direct descendants from Cro-Magnon. In fact, the mystery of Cro-Magnon is heightened when comparing his anatomy to ours. Though his average height was 6'1.5, that's 6 foot and 1.5 inches, but with relatively short arms, which is a sign of high development, his brain case was extraordinarily large in capacity, much larger than ours today. The larger Cro-Magnon are measured at 6'7" tall, and interestingly, Cro-Magnon women were petite. This is evidence of a race with superior intellectual development and a long history of civilized living, allowing for their females to cease growing to proportionate stature with the males of their race. That could have only happened in a sedentary atmosphere. M.D. Shorn relates that the Cro-Magnon was a powerfully built Caucasoid race, white, wearing sewn embroidered clothing of skins, who was also wore modern trousers, jackets, and hats. Cro-Magnon people looked like any Midwestern farmer of the 1930s in rural America. Cro-Magnon wore a cap, trousers, tunics, and moccasin-like shoes. The men sported beards and mustaches, and the women had elaborately parted or braided hair. Remember, we're talking about a race of people who existed before Elam, Egypt, Sumer, Akkad, Eritrea, Mitanni, the Urimbaba Valley, the Harappan civilization, the ancient Sino-Chinese empire of the Yellow Yangtze River, the South American empire. Every single known historical civilization to date came way after the people that I'm describing right now. A global freezing ended the conditions and civilizations of a prior world where Cro-Magnon thrived as the Neanderthal waned. A history for which there are no monuments, no artifacts, no memories, and virtually no ancient records save a few fragments that mention the prehistoric catastrophe before the beginning of our own Homo sapiens age of urbanization that began circa 3400 BC. The Cro-Magnon we have excavated and studied, a post-cataclysmic culture after an ice age period, is clearly seen in that the Cro-Magnon lived and hunted in a world of the megafauna. Enormous mammals like the mammoth depicted in Cro-Magnon are now known to have been a temperate to tropical animal. The high cultivation and potential of Cro-Magnon were the magnum opus of Homo Anunna's genetic engineering, and therefore a threat. In unrecorded history prior to 4309 BC, when their civilization was destroyed, Homo Anunna visited Earth, created Cro-Magnon after using mammalian DNA after a period of development and failures. The product complete and performing as intended, Homo Anunna had departed. But upon their return to the planet, they found the thriving Cro-Magnon civilization was in full bloom. They had broken the chains of slavery, driven Neanderthal to the caves of the earth, mastered nature, established societies, learned how to modify holospheric reality to conform to their will, and Cro-Magnon genius had discovered the greatest revelation of all, their immortality. That physical life was merely a temporary path to a personal, eternal existence. Homo Anunna found, to their dismay, that they had manufactured a sentient species having the potential to rival their own superiority, having the intellect and spiritual intuition to someday realize that they were actually confined in a holospheric prison, and quite possibly how to collapse it. Furious, Homo Anunna modified Cro-Magnon coding in a dangerous series of alterations that created monsters bereft of souls, hybrids, insensate bodies, creatures more than creations. DNA is fantastically ancient and still a mystery to extraterrestrial civilizations. Homo Anunna learned that DNA is pro-life, self-aware, sentient, and that the creations of new sentient beings can only be effected by merging pre-existing coding with pre-existent sentient DNA. Before seeking to destroy them, Homo Anunna manufactured Cro-Magnon to perfection by simply taking chimpanzee mammalian DNA and grafting in whole sequences of their own, Anunna DNA. Not enough Anunna DNA resulted in the earlier Neanderthal, and too much had now resulted in Cro-Magnon. The genetic palindromes, the latent genes switched off, are mysterious, but it is obvious that once created, DNA itself maintains a fail-safe guardian protocol that prohibits the erasing of life forms imbued with intelligence. The coding defense mechanism disallows conception, disallows propagation of a contaminated species. The Anunna, having made Cro-Magnon close to their own image, discovered to their dismay that they could by no manipulation unmake him. Their first trespass was now compounded by another. The Anunna made diluted DNA clones that could not reproduce. Production of clones resulted in a worthless workforce. With Cro-Magnon thriving on Earth, the Anunna further added to their crimes in the design, manufacture, and implementation of a devastating device, the Phoenix weapon. My books, When the Sun Darkens and Nostradamus and Plans of Apocalypse, as well as over 14 or 15 of the videos on this channel and several posts go into great detail on this Anunna technology. See the Phoenix calendar. It has been shown extensively that deployment of this weapon causes terrestrial disasters of local, hemispheric, and sometimes worldwide dimensions, and always bathes the earth in a red dust that falls to the surface like fine powder, or as a red rain that visits with terrible earthquakes and a horn-like sound that vibrates so catastrophically that whole cities and people are sink straight into the ground. The first deployment of the Phoenix weapon was against Cro-Magnon civilization. Many millions died, survivors scattered during a cataclysm of quakes, volcanic resurfacing, flooding, and red mud fallout from the sky. It is this history that solves a great anthropological mystery that has perplexed the academies. The use of red ochre in dressing the dead for burial. Red ochre use is evidence of a sentimental race wanting all of their dead to be rejoined in an afterlife. This nightmarish end of their civilization was dressed in red blood rains, red muds from the sky, and choking reddish dust. From that point onward, Cro-Magnon added to the dead host on the other side all those who passed over afterward a reddish ochre placed into their graves in commemoration of how they fell. The past is always a predicate for the future. What Cro-Magnon suffered, the absolute catastrophic collapse of their civilization's entire infrastructure, is going to happen to us as well. Many books Posts and Archaix's YouTube videos show this to be dated at precisely May 15th, May 16th of the year 2040. Of further significance, as we know in the biblical passages, it says the last days are going to be as the days of Noah. And in the days of Noah, apparently we had cloning. Apparently we had the birth of mutants. We had genetic manipulation. We had extreme, huge cultural and nationwide racial issues and problems between peoples on this planet. It says these issues from antiquity that happened right before a devastating cataclysm have all revisited us again. We are cloning again. We've seen clones in the media. We are conducting genetic manipulations. The cloning of the sheep Dolly in 1999 was just the beginning. And the mapping of the genome project in 2001, that was 50 years after we had really done it. It said, like I said, the past is a predicate for the future. The things that were happening, this Cro-Magnon civilization, these people were no different than us. They had buttons on their flies. They wore tassels on their dresses. They wore sandals. They wore suspenders. They had hats. They wore pants. It's ridiculous how similar the ancient world is to what is transpiring today. This concludes the third video of this series, the Anunna Files. Our point here in this video is to show that the racial problems that were occurring just before the flood, the manipulations, the actual creation of retardation genes that would create arrested development as soon as the Negroid, the Mongoloid, the Amerindic, the High Oriental, the Dark Caucasoid, when they attained a plateau and a period of enlightenment, vast metropolis, a huge infrastructure, great cities, once they reached a certain height, their own genetics would make war against them and collapse their civilizations. Genetic warfare, it was all created in antiquity. It's still done today, but it's all coming to an end. This is a series of simulated holographies that were all interwoven into a matrix that we call the past. And they're unwinding. Entropy has set in. Things are falling apart. Revelations are being made. People are being awakened. Those who concentrate on the issues are going to get swallowed by them. Just remember that. Hi, this is Jason of Archaix.com. This is our fourth video in the series of the Anunna Files. Now, we have already mentioned that race is a very delicate issue, and we want to respectfully submit to you, our listeners, that we decided as the Archaix team not to really approach this topic until we had already had a significant presence. And I think 105 videos is significant enough. We have already put well over 100 videos before we decided to talk about this, but these are issues that need to be discussed because we have to understand what's happening in the world today, because what is unfolding in our current paradigm is absolutely attached and moored through. It's tethered to the events of the past. The space-time continuum is a very interesting thing, and reality tunnels can exist for thousands of years before they collapse. So don't be offended by the things you hear. Assess them. Don't take offense, because no one can ever predict who they're going to be born into. But you forget, before you take offense, go back and listen to our prior videos. Several videos in the past, we have explained that because we believe that we exist in a series of holographic template simulations, we also hold it to be true that we have lived many lifetimes. We have all been every race on this planet. Who you are now is nothing but the architecture of a physical avatar pretending to be in a physical world, imprisoning a spiritual being. That's who you are right now. Your personality is what makes you divine. The peptides and RNA and DNA gene palindromic sequences that make up who you are is not you. It's a physical husk. It's a shell. But the history of the world is racial. And before the flood, race wars erupted. 300 years after the flood. We haven't got to the Battle of Kuruksada yet. We're having an entire video being prepared on that one. But it was a race war. The Mahabharata and the Bhagavad Gita, the Puranas, the Atharva Veda, man, we have all the elements of race wars in the past. There's nothing new under the sun. And I want to specify that it is my personal belief through years of research that this racial problem isn't ours. We can't control our genetics. It was programmed. It's not normal. Man, I've got some guys, man, that I am really cool with that are not white guys. And you know what? It doesn't matter. When we're together, man, there's a spiritual bond. There's a friendship. It's just, this racial paradigm that we're in today is foisted upon us. And the fires are stoked by the media. We can't allow this to continue. We need to explore where it came from. It starts with the Anunna. It starts in the world before the flood. In the world before the flood, we are told, as in the days of Noah, so also shall be the coming of the Son of Man. And all the Son of Man prophecies, no matter what you believe, if you're a student of the Gnosis like I am, or if you're a Christian, or if you're a Muslim and you're believing in the coming of the Mahdi, it doesn't matter. What matters is that we're in this together. And that there is something in this holography that's trying to keep us apart. Don't get mad about what you hear. Just think about it. Every single human being in this world has varying amounts of Anunnaki DNA. To be led, but not initiate. To comprehend, but not conceive. The masses of humanity suffered a genetic programming of arrested development. Designer DNA by Homo Anunna, scientists who had figured out how to keep their human subordinates docile and ignorant, yet teachable. The Homo sapiens of all races, from Negroid to Caucasoid, were perfectly enslaved by masters who programmed synaptic failsafes to switch off any time a human mind wandered beyond recognizable frames of reference. Because of this programming, Negroid, Mongolid, Dark Caucasoid, Amerindic, and High Oriental from the Neolithic to Agrarian remained virtually unchanged until they experienced contact with the civilized people. Without civilized immersion into a more advanced culture, their programming resets them right back into their pre-civilized patterns. So effective was this genetic dampening that it was not until the European colonial period when Caucasians introduced modern civilization into China, India, the Middle East, Australia, the Americas, and South America that these genetically damaged peoples around the world benefited from, copied, and began contributing to the modern infrastructure from their prior old primitive patterns. The dark-haired white people called Iberians anciently inhabited Spain, Gaul, the British Isles, colonized Sicily, and were the original settlers of Italy and Sardinia and even Libya. It is theorized that the dark-haired stock of early Sweden and Norway is also of Iberian stock. Of the Turduli and the Turdentani Iberians, Strabo, over 2,000 years ago, wrote that they employ the arts of writing and have written books containing memorials of very ancient times. The last surviving population of Iberians not absorbed into the other Mediterranean races of today are the Basques, of darker complexion than the Spaniards, with gray eyes and black hair. This Iberian stock settled in the earliest times in Ireland, forming the base of the dark-haired population of Britain and Scotland. These darker, short Bretons are in stark contrast to the tall, white-skinned, blue-eyed Celts with their blonde hair. There are no known written texts older than 2200 BC. Even the Sumerian records are post-2200 BC, though report to be copies of older writings and even depict events that date as early as 3800 BC. The oldest writings in the world are not religious. They tell matter-of-factly of gods that manufactured humans both before and after major disasters. The only architectural presence of humans known to archaeology prior to 2200 BC are town-sized settlements, many exhibiting evidence of advanced urban engineering and planning, the scattered survivors of a prior civilization destroyed by a cataclysm anterior to that of the Great Flood of 2239 BC. Because of these facts, we have had to rely solely on secondhand information and traditions. But we are fortunate, for out of this wealth of lore and legends has come forth common themes that cannot be denied, for they remain intact in both hemispheres. They claim that gods came to Earth. Early humans worshipped, served, and fought for them. The same gods that created the four brother races, black, brown, red, and yellow. During this period, white people did not exist. There are no Negroid, Mongolid, Amerindic traditions of a pre-flood world, but all remember a great flood. Is this not unusual? Only the Oriental peoples preserve literary records with the Caucasians concerning antediluvian histories. The Orientals during the contact period of 3439 to 2647 BC, when the Anunna lived among mankind, were the most genetically refined Homo sapiens of the Anunnaki birth goddesses program, having the most modified DNA compatible with Anunna biology. In 2839 BC, the Anunna factions began a widespread breeding campaign that resulted in the birth of the Caucasian race in the Igigi-born Nephilim races. Enki and the Anunna, loyal to him, used Oriental females in birthing Caucasians instead of the older scheme of using Anunna females who conceived through artificial inception, until the Adamas could conceive on their own. These were the first people. But the Igigi, who had not participated in the Enki-led long genetic refining process, took the daughters of men, of Mongoloids, Amerindics, Dark Caucasoids, and Negroids, and they gave birth to other peoples, some small, others gigantic, mutants with 6 fingers and toes on their limbs, monsters. Their activities were unsanctioned and unprotected, and this is why the Igigi rebellion had taken place. This was the origin of the Nephilim. In 2839 to 2647 BC, the contact period, only the Oriental civilization of Asia maintained a culture and geography extending back to the antediluvian world. As the greatest creations of the custodial society of the Anunna, the Oriental race is the older half-brother to the Nohakian white sons of the custodians. While even as late as the 20th century CE and today, 5,000 years has not improved the Neolithic hunter-gatherer mindset of Negroid, Mongoloid, and Amerindic people still spread across third world bushlands from Australia, Southeast Central Asia, and Africa, and Central and South America. If the infrastructure for civilization is not provided for them, they never invent one on their own. The non-Europoid peoples have over and over through 42.5 centuries of recorded history since the Great Cataclysm in 2239 BC been introduced to higher culture, have developed great cities and civilizations, philosophical systems, economies, trade routes, but something has always impeded any further development. A reset set into their very genetics, a weapon of DNA. Even flourishing when living among Homo Anunna, the Orientals and Caucasians, as long as the contact persisted, but when abandoned, when contact was severed or diminished, in every historical instance, these peoples collapsed back into barbarism, back to hand-to-mouth Neolithic patterns of totemic hunter-gatherers. World history is evidence alone of the long-standing dominance of the Oriental and the Aryan civilizations in the Far East and the Far West. The Oriental was programmed to stay in the Orient. Asians were very rarely colonizers outside of Asia. Many firsts belonged to China, Japan, Korea, and other Asian peoples when explosions of intellectual brilliance manifested, but the overall genetic coding of racial, cultural, mental stability of the race over and over stamped out the achievements and discoveries. The Aryan, though originating in the Far East, was specifically programmed to colonize, migrate, explore, build, invent, maintain a Western movement. The Aryan breeding produced a builder race, innovators, creators of governments, religions, philosophies, agriculture, and designers of vast infrastructures with great imaginations, the direct inheritors of traits formerly belonging only to Homo Anunna. The Asian Oriental was the epitome of Anunnaki genetic in vitro fertilization engineering using Anunnaki birth goddesses. The Oriental spirit of permanence, patience, humility, preservation of cultural institutions over millennia, explosions of brilliance only to be snuffed out by the masses programmed to maintain the status quo. The Anunnaki coded humans to obey, to carry out routines, to bear circumstances with little thought of altering their conditions. Orientals are fantastic culture bearers, carrying their civilization virtually unchanged for over 4,000 years until Caucasians arrived on their shores in the last 140 years and using military ships made them open their ports. and included them in the glowing global industrial technological complex. By the earliest accounts, the Caucasian race came from the Far East, the ancient Ainu of Japan, the Caucasians of the Sino Valley. The Caucasian skeletons have been found everywhere in China. This is easily found. You can do your own research on that. But they have always maintained a Western movement and moved into the Near East long after it was established. In fact, the entire Tarim Basin used to be a Caucasian civilization until it was met with the Black Star of Cataclysm. The Anunnaki themselves had sons and daughters, and many took lovers from among the growing masses of humanity that were becoming more and more in their own likeness. By the time the Anunnaki departed Earth, they had left behind human races in various gradations of development, from primitive workers to civilized Orientals, the black-headed people, and finally the Caucasian Indo-Aryan race of blonde, red-haired, blue-eyed, green-eyed people who served as the genetic descendants closest to resemble their Anunnaki masters. All races have Anunna DNA. All are made in the image coding of the pseudo-gods. That the Caucasian race is related to the older Asian Oriental race is also the conclusion of the historian Lenormand, who wrote, "All appearances would lead us to regard the Tauranian race as the first branch of the family of Japheth, which went forth into the world, and by the premature separation, by an isolated and antagonistic existence, took or rather preserved a completely distinct physiognomy. It is a type of the white race imperfectly developed." Winchell concludes that the Genesis 10 genealogical table is not intended to include the Negroes, or the Chinese, the Japanese, or the American red men. I repeat, if you're not following, the Jewish written Genesis table of nations, which is supposed to include the entire world who separated from the Babel cataclysm and went in all different directions, it doesn't mention any of these people in those writings. It refers altogether to the Mediterranean races, the Aryans, the Cushites, the Phoenicians, the Hebrews, and the Egyptians. The descendants of Noah were a race whose homeland was destroyed by a flood. The flooding may have occurred worldwide, but not in all areas. Chinese, Mongolid, Negroid, Amerindic people survived uninterrupted in hunter-gatherer totem societies, save for the sophisticated agrarian urban culture of China. The table of nations in Genesis was copied and amended as the Jewish priests saw fit, stealing the data from older Amorite records in Babylon. In those days, when the genealogies were drafted to include in the new 5th century BC Genesis text, they wanted to put in the front of their holy writ the existence of other races to the Jews was not known. Therefore, they were not included. They did not know about the Chinese and the Korean and the Japanese, the Ainu. They knew nothing about them, so they didn't create them in their book of Genesis. Caucasians are the very last to enter into the world scene in modern times, post-Cro-Magnon. The most ancient traditions and written records are from the perspective of non-Caucasian people, and this is clearly shown in other posts and videos, and we will do another video as well. The first appearance of Caucasians in the ancient pre-flood world shocked the world because it was a world without white people. This is JasonArchaix.com. This is our 5th video of the day in the new series, the Anunna Files, but it is by far not the last video. We have many more videos on Anunnaki, Anunna, ancient Sumerian history, because we're going to set the record straight. We're going to show in chronology, we're going to show in anthropology, we're going to show in archaeology, and in historical text, fact from fiction. But we wanted to release 5 videos in one day to get this started so people can get a really good grasp. These 5 videos are only an overview. We're going to go into a lot of detail. We're going to be producing some fantastic charts and illustrations to show what it is we're talking about, to open your eyes about what truly transcended in the ancient world. We have an enemy. He's a common enemy, but he's a mastermind. He created divisiveness, and he knew by altering the genome to create subtle changes in the human species, and then encode emotional markers in that coding to make us dislike people who are not like ourselves. Man, you can break free of that programming, but it's difficult because everything everything around you serves as a catalyst to fall back into those synaptic fail-safes. That's what they are. They were programmed by an enemy. But we're going to override that. We're going to move past it, and we're going to explore this situation like no one has before. And we're going to get to the bottom of the Anunnaki and what it means for us today. This is JasonArchaix.com. Enjoy this presentation. This is only video 5 of many more. Thousands of historic and modern testimonies concerning extraterrestrial contact have witnesses describing the alien beings as tall, blue-eyed, blonde human-like entities that are usually accompanied by servile fetus-like aliens much shorter. This intriguing description is of the modern Nordics, the Nephilim, hybrids being genetically created by the fetus-like corporal dark angels that are building a race of semi-giants as they had done twice in biblical history. In the days of Noah, both before and after the flood. Blonde hair, blue eyes, and tall features are descriptive of the Egyptian racial portraits and reliefs in the temples cited earlier in these works on the temples of Karnak, of the Sabaeans, the Amorites, and the Anakim, the Tamahu, all partially descended from the Anunna. These mysterious aliens, witnessed by thousands of people, are described by Raymond E. Fowler in his epic book, The Watchers, as tall, blonde, robed, human-like entities. Interestingly, the gods Osiris and Orion, Nimrod, were regarded as being the same deity to the early Egyptians. He too wore a robe with many eyes like a watcher. This description calls to mind the Sumerian giant Gilgamesh, whose name means son of the sun, and the angelic watchers that descended and taught men the secrets of God in exchange for the daughters of men. Concerning the strange physical characteristics of the gods of the mysterious Sumerians, Eric von Daniken proclaims that the figures and statues of these people appear to fit no racial group known on Earth, having goggle eyes, domed foreheads, narrow lips, and generally long, straight noses. Traits cited that belong to the Amorite and Anakim giants and the large Aryan mummies in the Chinese Taklamakan Desert. In The Two Babylons by Alexander Hislop, we discover that the racial traits of gods and goddesses around the world from Babylonia, Egypt, India, Greece, and Rome were of blue or gray-eyed, blonde-haired entities with fair features. In more contemporary times, the high Nordic appearance of humans belonged to fairy children. Catherine Briggs, in her huge book, An Encyclopedia of Fairies, writes that when fairies search for mortal children of a golden-haired child is far more in danger of being stolen by the fairies than a dark one. In the Encyclopedia of Fairies on page 62, Captives in Fairyland, we read that trolls derive from Nordic beliefs in fairies. These creatures were associated to the underworld and stole small children and sometimes even swapped troll babies for human infants. Some trolls were giants that guarded passes or bridges, like the Nephilim of old. The motive assigned to fairies in northern countries is that of preserving and improving their race. On the one hand, by carrying off human children to be brought up among the elves and to become united with them, and on the other hand, by obtaining the milk and fostering of human mothers for their own offspring. Such traditions of fair-featured infants took on other forms in other cultures. In the Yarison text of the 13th century Common Era, or I believe it's Ayahab ol Malukat, the race of pre-human genies, jinn, were shape-changers that could appear as snakes or scorpions or men. These jinn were on earth before Adam, or the Adamu, before the first people, having been ousted from the heavens. They were accused of switching infants of their own race with human babies. And Muslim traditions hold that the children of the jinn had white European features. The Shamaneh, written by Arab poet Ferdowsi, a Muslim of Eastern Persia, composed the work based from older traditions. It is called the Book of Kings, claiming that Zal, who is a hero like Noah, survivor of a flood, was a son of the Devic race, an ancient race of gods. As attested in the Book of Enoch, the Dead Sea text, and the Arabic Shemana, Andrew Collins observed that the antediluvian patriarchs of the Old Testament would seem to have had a very similar aversion to infants born with what appeared to have been extremely white Caucasian features. This is not me, guys. This is from Andrew Collins, a renowned international author, in his book, From the Ashes of Angels, on page 112. The flood hero Noah was born in 2839 BC, the year 1056 of the pre-flood calendar, the Annus Mundi system. In the Book of Enoch, we find that at the birth of Noah, his father Lamech was alarmed, for the infant Noah was white as snow and red as the blooming of a rose, and the hair of his head and his long locks were white as wool, and his eyes were beautiful. And when he opened up his eyes, he lighted up the whole house like the sun. Lamech told Methuselah, a very ancient man at the time, that I have begotten a strange son, diverse from and unlike men, and resembling one of the sons of the gods of heaven. And his nature is different. He is not like us. The fear of antediluvian people was that they were too small compared to the fair-featured figures they were referring to as gods, the Anunna, tall, bearded Caucasians. To primitive, uneducated people, these strangers were with pale features and white skin were angels. The Ethiopian Kebra Nagas text reveals that the children born to angels through the daughters of the Canaanites were so large that women were ripped open. You must remember, these ancient stories are from the perspective of people who have never seen Caucasians before, and they were very small. They had smooth skin. They were dark-skinned, dark-eyed, dark-featured, and they were very petite bodies. And to them, Caucasians appeared to be as giants. Enki, who we know as Enoch, and his loyalists mated with these females of the civilized humans who gave birth to the first Caucasoid baby, Noah, in 2839 BC. The many Anunna or Anunnaki sons of God took the many daughters of men and begat the Caucasian race rapidly. It was a program. The first generation of infants born were Caucasians having dark recessive gene characteristics, white people with dark hair and dark eyes. But the second and third generation females were fair, appearing more and more like the Anunna themselves. The Anunna human crossbreeding program, sometime after the start of the contact period in 3439 BC, but in 2839 BC, the project was completed with the birth of Homo sapiens who were of the same DNA and appearance as Homo Anunna. They were indistinguishable. Caucasians were very tall compared to the darker races before the flood, bearded, which to the other races was a mark of godhood, with white skin and eyes like gemstones. These beards are the reason why the Egyptian pharaohs always wore wooden beards. They remembered ancient dynasties of ruling Caucasians who were bearded, and it was a sign of their divinity. The pharaohs had smooth skin and could not grow hair on their faces, so they had ornamental beards made of wood, and they were dipped in gold. And this is why we have so many statues of Egyptians with hairless faces wearing fake beards. It was out of this genetic campaign that Enki took a fair female and fathered the famous Noah, an extremely white, blue-eyed, blonde child in the 600th year before the Great Flood. This began the Noachian race, called in antiquity by other races as the sons of the sun because of the color of their skin and hair, and in ancient Egypt as Shemsu Hor, and after the flood as the Shepherd Kings. Zechariah Sitchin, writing of the birth of Noah, described him as white as snow his skin was. The color of wool was his hair. Like the skies were his eyes, blue. This is in the Lost Book of Enki. I don't know what Sitchin's source materials are, but they're definitely Near Eastern. He might have copied that straight out of the Book of Enoch. But that's on page 204. So with this whole historical phenomenon of the arrival of the Anunnaki, basically, in my opinion, as someone who has read well over 1,000 books on ancient history, I don't care about YouTube videos. I don't even watch other channels. You will never see me cite another channel or an internet source. I'm not going to do it. But in my own research, I am painting a picture. Our predecessors believed in the arrival of white gods that came and gave birth to civilization and created these different races and divisiveness. And I don't see that. What I see is that after a total world-destroying cataclysm, A Caucasian race who had been underground for a very long period of time and could not deal with the sun. Their skin was too translucent. Their eyes were way too sensitive. They knew in order to survive, they had to take some of the human stock that was surviving on the surface, and they interbred with them. And in doing that, we have the normal Caucasians of today. This is the story that I'm seeing. And as with many historical episodes that are recorded much later in time, we have embellishments. It wasn't gods descending from the sky. It was people coming up from the earth, from their deep earth biospheres, a technologically advanced, very intelligent race of people who had survived a global cataclysm. And when they did, they found nothing but Neolithic hunter-gatherers, Negroid, Mongolid, Oriental, Aboriginal, Dark Caucasoid, Iberian. This is what they found. And this huge story about the Anunnaki and the aliens coming from, it just didn't happen. Whoever these people were, they're trapped in this holography with us. But that's another story. We're going to continue with the series because we have many more revelations on the Anunnaki coming. We have barely scratched the surface on Anunnaki history until their disappearance in 1899 BC. Hey guys, this is Jason of Archaix.com. This is the 6th video of our Anunna Files series. We're going to return back just briefly in this one video back to the Cro-Magnon to add more elements to the story. Now, in the book of Revelation, we have a situation where we are told that it's going to get so bad that people are going to run to the hills and to the caves, and they're going to hide. And it actually says they're going to hide from the face of God. They're going to try and cower down and hope they survive. And what I'm telling you is that this has already happened. While it will happen again in the future, the reason why the future is known is because it already occurred in the past. The Cro-Magnon people have already suffered the exact same fate. It's why we found them in the caves. It's why they expressed themselves the only way they had left. After the collapse of their entire infrastructure, what was left to do but hunt, eat, and paint the most elaborate mosaics and beautiful pieces of art in caves found all around the Mediterranean world? It's a sad situation. The past is a predicate for the future. We are stuck in a loop of reset. The ancient Cro-Magnon people were not dissimilar from you and I. They believed in an afterlife, burying their dead with possessions. The bones of the dead were specially treated with red ochre after the flesh was removed. That Cro-Magnon man died out, as the Neanderthal is not the case. As Homo sapiens spread prolifically, the Cro-Magnon elements were absorbed. Only a little Cro-Magnon blood entered the Basque and Iberian streams, but by far the most is to be found in early Native Americans. The Cro-Magnon we are familiar with were post-cataclysm hunters of the megafauna and gatherers barely surviving in newer regions far away from the destroyed lands of their own nativity. Despite collapse of their civilization, Cro-Magnon, like the older Neanderthal, survived. The year the Phoenix weapon was used to depopulate the world, induce volcanic resurfacing to push up more rare earth metals and ores to the surface for mining by the Anunnaki, or the Anunna, was the year 4309 BC, 21 centuries before the very first pictographic writings emerged by the next wave of Anunna creations. With Cro-Magnon, we have a Caucasian race whose art remained unparalleled until the first millennium BC. They were an advanced people who had lost everything. Even establishment archaeologists have been perplexed as to why mathematics, astronomy, and calendar systems only appear thousands of years after the last ice age. The answer is a simple one. In 4309 BC, the Phoenix weapon shattered every faith the people had in the heavens and its stability, inducing a global freezing and series of disasters, critically depopulating our world. With Earth's axis pointing at Sol, it slowly rolled around the sun for 270 years, with one hemisphere frozen and dark while the other was bathed in continual sunlight, day and night being filled with the brightness of the sun. Our world literally rolled on a spit around the sun. Calendars became obsolete and the Cro-Magnon civilization collapsed as Neanderthal again multiplied against them, hunting them for food. The existence of the Cro-Magnon culture is evidence of a totally unknown, highly developed civilization on Earth that had collapsed in unrecorded antiquity, perhaps in the Anunnaki nodal dates of 5239 BC and 4309 BC in the very first historically recorded Phoenix cataclysm. These 600-year periods, these nodal aperture dates in the holosphere, are the subject of more videos coming, and it is a fascinating study. In northern New England, Nova Scotia, and Labrador in eastern Canada survived an archaic culture called the Red Ochre people, or the Red Paint people. These people ceremoniously buried the dead and sprinkled mineral red ochre over the bodies of the deceased and their interred possessions. The Red Paint people built megalithic chambers. They used metals and were a seafaring race, also called the Maritime Archaic culture. Some of their burials estimated to be 5,000 to 7,000 years old. The pole shift of 3895 BC totally rearranged the planetary topography. Traces of human occupation are found the world over dating to this exact period. Undeveloped Paleolithic communities scattered about in hunter-gatherer bands. The extent of human development is quite clear. People were little more than tool-using animals. During the shift, which would have lasted for days, we're talking about a lithospheric displacement, a pole shift, it could have lasted possibly a week. Vast tracts of the Earth's surface slipped under the ocean, a 30-degree displacement moving the lithosphere by at least 2,000 miles. Whole seas scouring dry land of its topsoil to leave deserts in their wake. Whole human populations vanished. Survivors relocated by following the fleeing herds. Neanderthal and Cro-Magnon, more suited to the conditions of cataclysm than the softer humans the Anunna deposited on the surface, teetered on the edge of extinction. Neanderthal were hardy and vicious, and archaeologists have discovered evidence that the last holdouts of the Neanderthal race actually hunted Homo sapiens. Human bones with butcher marks have been found charred in excavated Neanderthal campsites. Though the Cain and Abel story was a Jewish fiction, it conveys a very real fear of this period. Cain feared that his banish from the human family would result in his death by the others. Neanderthal stalked the mountains and the hills as the descendants of the Cro-Magnon wandered the valleys and the forests. In Croatia was discovered evidence that Neanderthal Cro-Magnon interbreeding did occur. The new Homo sapiens had much to fear in this world before the Great Flood. The 1986 discoveries of the Fontbregno cave in France have yielded evidence that Cro-Magnon man had also engaged in cannibalism. Humans were butchered, processed, raw meat stripped off the bones, which were then broken to extract the marrow. Concerning our 3895 BC Phoenix cataclysm pole shift, we have testimony from Plato in the Statesman. In the fullness of time, when the change was to take place and the earth-born race had all perished, the pilot of the universe let the helm go, reversed the motion of the world, and the world turning round with a sudden shock, being impelled in an opposite direction from the beginning to end, was shaken by a mighty earthquake, which wrought a new destruction of all manner of animals. Much of the Greek concept of mankind's beginning was borrowed from Egypt and the Near East, necessarily so, as no Caucasian, Aryan, Semitic people yet existed. To Plato, who knew that gods in the heavens made all the races of mankind, the older races of non-Homo sapien pedigree were regarded as earthborn. In his time period, the designations Neanderthal, Cro-Magnon, Homo inferior were unknown. This pole shift catastrophe is a fact of geology, paleobotany, geography, and other disciplines, though it is hardly remembered in human memory. Many of our historical accounts prior to the 20th century BC were recorded retrospectively through transmission of oral testimony, or, as will be shown, revealed to literate humans by non-human benefactors, sometimes over 1,000 years after the events occurred. Cro-Magnon artifacts of France reveal a high culture of artistic sophistication. Louis Spence wrote that the race which produced it cannot be classified as savage. In fluency and originality, at least, the Aurignacian pre-Magdalenian Cro-Magnon art is indeed greatly superior to that of either of ancient Egypt or Babylonia, and to achieve a standard of such surpassing excellence, it must have persisted elsewhere than in the area where it arrived at fruition for many thousands of years. It had to have had a long history in some other region before it was brought to Europe. This is an amazing testimony from a researcher over 120 years ago. Spence wrote, "We have an art fully developed and obviously having behind it many centuries of evolution, suddenly appearing in a locality in which there are no signs of earlier phases." Concerning the Aurignacian art, this is a type of Cro-Magnon, Spence wrote, "Its beginnings cannot be traced anywhere in the known world. The walls of the caverns they occupied are in many cases covered with drawings of animals and men which for accuracy of design and modeling have never been surpassed. Cro-Magnon art sometimes even used the natural protuberances to enhance the artwork and give it a three-dimensional effect." McAllister wrote that the origin of the European Cro-Magnon was not from Europe. Upon their arrival, they had already developed over a period of time elsewhere. Spence wrote that the Cro-Magnon man was cut off from his home by a cataclysm, marooned upon the shores of the Atlantic coast of Europe and Africa to spread into the Mediterranean before it was a sea. Before the Mediterranean was a sea. For those of you following my Great Pyramid research videos, you will know that I have shown ample evidence that the Mediterranean was once a series of lakes, and that's what we find here. And it was in very recent history when the Mediterranean became the Mediterranean and fleets of Caucasians entered into this newly developed sea coming from a post-cataclysmic North America in 2239 BC. We have history repeating itself. This is precisely what happened to ancient Cro-Magnon man. The Mediterranean Sea we know today was back then a series of valleys and freshwater lakes. This is not me saying this. This is the scientific reports of the time. The Aurignacian culture did not spread into Central or Eastern Europe, but they populated the lands and coasts of North Africa, Sicily, Spain, France, and Italy. As a culture of fishermen at a time when the Mediterranean basin was not a sea, but a system of fertile valleys with large lakes and vast forests teeming with game. The study of Cro-Magnon civilization is impeded by our assumption that the present geography and condition of our world is the same now as it was then. And as we have seen, this is not the case. The sudden appearance of the Mediterranean is also the reason why ancient civilizations during their literate period when they were developing writing systems have absolutely no written records about the building and the creation of the Great Pyramid. Because when literacy was exploding throughout the ancient Old Bronze Age, the Great Pyramid complex in Giza and all the North African plate was still underneath the Mediterranean. And this is why the ancient Egyptian civilization is not on the north coast where it should be in the Mediterranean, where their trade alliances would have been formed and their trade ports and their most chief cities should have been developed. Instead, the most ancient Egypt that we know of today, the Kemetian Egypt, Kemet, is 500 miles to the south and has no pyramids. They buried their dead in the Valley of the Kings, not in giant monuments. Spence wrote that the Aurignacian race was physiologically far superior to any human type presently existing. If cranial capacity is a measure of intellect, then Cro-Magnon had greater intellectual potential than modern Homo sapiens. As a highly developed race, both physically and mentally, we must conclude that our current discoveries of Cro-Magnon man are of his post-cataclysmic, degenerative state. While later Aurignacian further blossomed into the Magdalenian Cro-Magnon culture, this development was not a fundamental change, but rather a difference in degree. What is being said here is that the picture that anthropologists have painted of Cro-Magnon is as of a primitive person that was basically evolving into the Homo sapiens sapiens of today. But we now know that the genetic markers between Cro-Magnon and humans only show some contacts, but there wasn't a development from Cro-Magnon culture. They basically died out. Further, what we find Cro-Magnon huddled in caves and with beautiful paintings, we are looking at a people who had lost everything. We are looking at the last survivors of a great thriving civilization that the Phoenix weapon had completely ended. In 2239 BC, the land bridge at the Strait of Gibraltar, called the Pillars of Hercules in antiquity, broke from earthquakes, allowing the Atlantic Ocean to flood the basin, burying the majority of Cro-Magnon sites and artifacts. Cro-Magnon people migrated into the Mediterranean region prior to this catastrophe. There is no sign that Cro-Magnons ever migrated into Central Africa. They suddenly appeared along the Atlantic coast to Spain and France in the regions of Biscayan, Pyrenean, and Dordogne at the end of a glacial period and the end of the last true ice age. This was not approximately 11,000 BC as the Aku dummies purport, but sometime between 5239 and 4039 BC, as we will show conclusively in forthcoming videos about to be released. Cro-Magnon man is not a type of Homo inferior. In fact, today's Homo sapiens species is a slightly diluted, sabotaged, genetically impeded form of Cro-Magnon. Cro-Magnon are considered Homo sapiens, and it was a further genetic modification of Cro-Magnon man that resulted in modern Homo sapiens sapiens. Humans today are DNA designer products of Homo Anunna who used Cro-Magnon coding with newer modifications to develop Homo sapiens sapiens and fashion distinct races of Negroid, Mongolid, and High Oriental, Amerindic, and Dark Caucasoid. The white Caucasians did not yet exist. In fact, the first appearance of white-skinned, blue-eyed infants among the antediluvians is one of the major themes from the traditions of the pre-flood world. Even the pre-flood Sumerians prided themselves as being the black-headed people, and all their depictions in statuary and reliefs show themselves as a smooth-skinned, beardless people. The establishment of black, yellow, red, and brown races on Earth from the older Cro-Magnon stock was a deliberate act of divisiveness by Homo Anunna, induced arrested development, a managerial act to prevent humanity from succeeding at whatever feat of accomplishment Cro-Magnon had obviously attained in prehistory and to them had become a threat. The mounting body of worldwide evidence derived from the hundreds of reports of astonishing Technolithic archaeological sites is that the Cro-Magnon were descended survivors of a race who had terraformed this planet, and the evidence of their terraforming is everywhere. And this massive terraforming project that went all around the world was later basically buried in mud floods, and some of it later resurfacing and people finding these plateaus and these cities and building their own ruins and cities on top of these substructures. Whoever Cro-Magnon were, they had basically taken over the entire physicality of the holosphere by which we are all imprisoned in. Cro-Magnon had become a threat, and the rest of the existence of all races on this planet is because it had to be diluted. DNA is fantastically old and cannot be erased. It had to be changed. This is JasonArchaix.com. This is episode 7 of the Anunna Files. Imagine how ancient records describe somebody descending from a mountain, and yet thousands of years later, it turns into descending from the heavens. Imagine further that very old traditions and written records preserved today perfectly describe the arrival of a technologically advanced race of people never before seen on ships. Ships that sailed over the great deep, the ocean. But thousands of years later, those ships came from space. Imagine that. Enjoy this video. I promised you that we're going to go very deep into this Anunnaki and Anunna deal. I'm going to step on some toes. I'm going to hurt some feelings. There are people who have invested their faith in historical narratives that were absolutely fictional. The truth is far more fascinating than this super advanced UFO related alien species that came to planet and made humans. No. We live in a biosphere, a Dyson shell-like containment field. We're not going anywhere. And when you die and you get reincarnated, you come right back into a new avatar. Until this simulated holography collapses, we're stuck in this loop. Real history and real science is far more intriguing than this BS promoted in today's pop culture history. It is noteworthy that in the earliest records of the human race, the gods are physical beings who created Earth and then visited it. No other deities are known, no primordial unseen creator. The oldest texts leave no room for doubt. The only gods the pre-flood ancients knew came from heaven. It was after the Great Deluge and after the disappearance of the Anunnaki did religionists invent the fall of man traditions by rewriting particulars that had only pertained to the fall of the gods. If there is a conflict in heaven, if there is an ongoing war in the heavenly realm, if there is to be a reckoning, a divine judgment executed against one or more groups, these have nothing to do with mankind. Humans are DNA and harvest, victims of off-world manipulation, and enemy-manufactured humans with the unintended result of the designer DNA creating sentience enough that unconfined spirits outside the holosphere were pulled into physical bodies. Humans are biological spirit prisons, and this unintended consequence initiated a rift between opposing Anunna groups. A sufficiently powerful body of opposition rebelled against enslaving mankind and came to Earth as humanity's benefactors. And what I mean by they came to Earth, they did not arrive in spaceships. The ingress-egress points inside and outside of this holosphere are not spacecraft. There's nothing getting in and out of this impenetrable sphere that we have encapsulating our entire world. There are portals that we don't know about, but they do. And they continually whisk men and materials away from this world and reintroduce other materials, induce cataclysms, and they've been doing this over and over. Those Anunna who did not want to enslave mankind became the sinners, or those from the moon, sin, and it was their fall that disrupted Anunna plans to keep humans servile, cowed, ignorant, and uncivilized. The fall is predominantly a Western religious theme popularized in Babylonia. It was later heavily borrowed and adapted with Jewish dressings for the biblical records. Professor G.R.S. Mead in Fragments of a Forgotten Faith wrote, "A persistent tradition in connection with all the great mystery institutions was that their several founders were the introducers of all sorts of civilization. They were either themselves gods or were instructed by gods. In brief, that they were men of a far greater knowledge than any who had come after. They were the teachers of infant races, souls belonging to a more highly developed humanity than our own. A prior perfected humanity, not necessarily earthborn." You have to understand this is very interesting for a quote that's almost 100 years old. Andrew Collins, in his book From the Ashes of Angels, wrote, "The myths associated with these supernatural beings appear to be no more than the bastardized memories of the way in which survivors of a previous high civilization passed on their skills and capabilities to our own ancestors. If this is so, we are dealing with neither the divine nor the supernatural, but with physical beings of flesh and blood communicating on a one-to-one basis with early humankind." Jim Mars, in his book, Our Occulted History, adds that the Anunnaki found themselves marooned on a primitive world without their infrastructure to manufacture their tools, but still possessing a superior knowledge. The fallen ones, or those who from heaven to earth came, were a small group of hundreds of survivors of a planetary cataclysm away from Earth who were marooned on Earth by other survivors who did not stay, still in possession of the vehicles of their technology. This is how high civilization, engineering, agriculture, writing, arithmetic suddenly appeared in the Neolithic during the Ubaid culture of southern Iraq and the birth of Sumer. Now, these are the ideas as conveyed since the era of Daniken in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and early thousands. This is the paradigm that many have accepted, that it is a interstellar civilization that arrived here and gave us these things. But it's not true. And we'll get to that in coming posts and videos. But Will Hart in the Genesis Race wrote that what we find is an explosion of development, a quantum leap compressed into a mere fraction of humanity's existence as a species, a radically changed way of being, and an entirely new survival strategy based on the human engineering of plants and animals undreamed of by those of the Paleolithic period. These four popular authors were not the first to theorize these things. Charles Fort wrote about off-world manipulation of humans in history 70 to 80 years ago. The time when this was supposed to occur is best summed up by Hart. In the Genesis Race, he wrote, a major development thrust between 3500 BC and 1500 BC, a sudden explosion of innovation in these distinct areas of our world. These 6 regions were Egypt, Sumer, Harappa, the Indus Valley, China, Mexico, and Bolivia, Peru. Hart asserts that at this time, a superhuman race taught mankind how to be human. He continues, the fact that these ancient cultures do not take credit themselves for their achievements only supports the conclusion that indeed the gods were the source of the amazing explosion of growth and innovation that occurred in 3500 BC to 3000 BC. And also, there is no traceable step-by-step path leading to them from the hunter-gatherer way of life. Science does not explain the Sumerian sudden, unprecedented explosion of development. Almost 100 years ago, Lewis Spence wrote, the histories of all peoples commence with a dynasty of god kings, only shading later into real history as time proceeds. The Greek and Roman dynasties, the Egyptian, the Babylonian, the Mexican, the Central American annals all began with traditional notions of the lives and deeds of heaven-descended monarchs. Over 50 years before the ancient astronaut theory began taking root, many scholars concluded that at this time in history, Egypt's civilization suddenly appeared. The civilization of Egypt at its first appearance was of a higher order than any subsequent period of its history, thus testifying that it drew its greatness from a fountain higher than itself. And this is an admission by the scholars, the academics. They are conceding that yes, civilization suddenly appeared, and it was of such a high degree that later Egyptian dynasties, 26 dynasties, never achieved the level of sophistication that was at the very start. Ernest Renan wrote, Egypt at the beginning appears mature, old, and entirely without mythical and heroic ages, as if the country had never known youth. Its civilization has no infancy, and its art no archaic period. It was already mature. Donnelly further wrote, there is no evidence that the civilization of Egypt was developed in Egypt itself. Citing Blackwood's magazine, Ignatius Donnelly continued, as soon as men were planted on the banks of the Nile, they were already the cleverest men that had ever lived, endowed with more knowledge and more power than their successors for centuries and centuries could attain. Their system of writing also is found to have been complete from the very first, as we have not yet discovered any trace of the rude, savage Egypt. Our deepest researches have hitherto shown her to us as only the mother of a most accomplished race. Of early Egypt, Renan wrote, it has no archaic period. The historian Osborne wrote, it bursts upon us at once in the flower of its highest perfection. The historian Cease wrote, wrote that it suddenly takes its place in the world in all its matchless magnificence, without father, without mother, as if it had dropped from the unknown heavens. And the famous Rawlinson wrote, all the authorities agree that however far back we go, we find in Egypt no rude or uncivilized time out of which civilization could have developed. Anthropologists cannot account for the leap, and the archaeologists cannot help but find that the leap occurred anciently and everywhere. We understand this mystery as having its origin with Homo Anunna, passing on their knowledge to their own descendants after they had arrived from somewhere else. Not a development, but an inheritance. The beginning of this explosion of development at 3500 BC, according to Hart, is an approximate that matches nicely with the 3439 BC first arrival of Enki and a small group of Anunna, as we have shown in many posts and mentioned in prior videos, but we're about to release a couple videos on and show the actual Babylonian and Akkadian chronologies that prove this. It was the appearance of Enki, the biblical Enoch, and the Anunna who began pre-flood Egyptian civilization in 3439 BC. The life and career of Enki Enoch is revealed in Chronicon, free at archaix.com, but we're about to release some posts about him and show how the chronological records of ancient history comport exactly with what the anthropologists and archaeologists have found in ancient Egypt and with the oldest records in the world. One of the greatest sensationalists of our time is Zechariah Sitchin. Sitchin knew that the gods of Egypt were men. The Egyptian word for the gods was NTR, Neter, or Neteru, or one who watches. The hieroglyphic sign for Neteru gods was a pole with a flag, which is an ensign. Sitchin cites Margaret Murray's In the Splendor That Was Egypt concerning pre-dynastic pottery adorned with drawings of boats carrying a pole and two streamers as a standard, which Murray concluded became the hieroglyphic sign for God. Sitchin notes that the interesting thing is that these pre-dynastic drawings showed the boats arriving from a distant land, towers, and a standing tall figure wearing a helmet with horns, the mark of being a Neter, the mark of the Neteru, being a horned deity, such as what you see on the stele of Naram Sin. Sitchin concludes that the Egyptians affirmed from the very beginning that their gods had come to Egypt from elsewhere. Interestingly, the Ta Neter was a narrow strait at the southern end of the Red Sea through which ships had arrived bearing the newly arrived gods of Egypt, the horned gods, men like Vikings. One who watches is a watcher. The gods were men. Sitchin associated the Anunnaki to the Neter many times, but created a scenario of men arriving in spaceships. But the earliest records had these gods landing on the shores of ancient Egypt in mundane ships on water, which requiring towers. Sitchin was also a very well-read man, and he knew of the discoveries and the published conclusions of Professor Waddell that prove that the first dynasty of Egypt was not Egyptian, it was Sumerian. And that in the Sumerian records, the founding of Egypt is found, and how Menes landed with a fleet of ships, and how the local indigenous population, the Melampides of Egypt, were very primitive, and they regarded these people as gods. The Babylonians have a tradition that retells this exact same scenario. Oannes created man according to the Babylonians. This identifies him as one among the Anunna. He is also the father of metallurgy, a very unusual fact since no metals of any significance have ever been mined in Mesopotamia. Oannes and his ship of people arrived 1,200 years or 432,000 days before the Great Flood. Ignatius Donnelly, concerning the beliefs of Oannes, wrote, "This is clearly the tradition preserved by a barbarous people of the great ships of a civilized nation who colonized their coast and introduced the arts and sciences among them. In every instance, the first appearance of the Anunna coincides with natural disasters and the arrival of a fleet of ships. The more we study the pieces of the past, the more we find advanced humans mistaken for gods upon their arrival among very primitive non-Caucasian peoples. It's the same situation that happened in World War II with the cargo cults. If you're not familiar with the cargo cult phenomenon, it is very real and well documented, and establishment researchers do not like it being cited. The cargo cults were created when primitives in the South Pacific had their islands taken over by the U.S. military, by the French, and by the British expeditionary forces. These islands were taken over, airstrips were created, and suddenly ships and airplanes landed with supplies. U.S. troops, U.S., French, and British troops scoured the islands, and next thing the local inhabitants knew was that their islands were being overrun by these technologically advanced white people who had metal birds dropping all kinds of good tasting things from the sky, and cigarettes, cigars, toys, all kinds of interesting things for the locals. U.S. military was dropping to gain their trust, and basically just to keep them happy and keep them out of the way while we were conducting military operations during World War II. After the war was over and many of these islands were abandoned by the militaries of the Allied powers, these people wanted these metal birds to drop more crates on parachutes to bring them more smokes and lighters and cigars and good tasting foods and interesting fruit that they had never seen before, and foods and meats and clothes and toys. So they built altars in the effigy of the things they saw. They built statues in the likeness of the soldiers they saw. And they prayed to these, hoping that they would induce the metal birds to come back and again drop these things on these islands. This is a very well recorded phenomenon. It's called the cargo cult phenomenon. It's a perfect example of what happened over 5,500 years ago in ancient Sumer, in Egypt, the Urubamba Valley, the Harappan Valley. All these different valley civilizations were basically overrun and taken over by ships. Fleets of ships from a people who had completely lost their own homeland in a cataclysm. So we'll be going deeper into this, not just the chronology, but the cataclysm itself. Actual records that are preserved today that mention this cataclysm and what happened and how it destroyed 1/3 of the entire human population. And the survivors showed up and became what Genesis 6 calls the sons of God. Hey, I want to thank you guys that have donated, who have bought me a coffee or bought me 5 coffees, who have gone to archaix.com, checked out the material, and were impressed enough, and you had the means and you donated on my PayPal. I want to personally thank you right now. You are not forgotten. When these chronology posters are finished, I have you on my list. You will receive a copy. I just want to tell my listeners, man, that I do deeply appreciate what help you have given me. Some of you have sent me books to check out and look at. I appreciate everything that you have done. I said your donations have actually accelerated my ability to produce videos. As you've seen, I'm putting them out faster. It's hey man, I'm just trying to get all this material, but I really sincerely have about 300 more videos to release before I'm done. And together, I'm hoping that we can all put this entire mystery of the human race together and benefit from it.